Hello and welcome to the next session of machine learning course. Today I am going to discuss about dimensional reduction. In machine learning classification problem, there are often too many factors on the basis of which the final classification is done. These factors are basically variables called features. The higher the number of features, the harder it gets to visualize the training set and then work on it. Sometimes most of these features are correlated and hence redundant. This is where dimensionality reduction algorithms come into play. Dimensional reduction is the process of reducing the number of random variables under consideration by obtaining a set of principal values. It can be divided into feature selection and feature extraction. As you can see here, also the performance of classifier and models depend on the dimension of features and data. For example, in the image that follows, it can be seen that with an increase in dimension beyond the optimal number, classifier performance goes on decreasing. This is the optimal number of features. In the image that follows, it can be seen that with an increase in dimension beyond the optimal number, classifier performance goes on decreasing. Here the dimensionality, number of feature, y-axis is classifier performance. There are some advantages of this algorithm. The first one, the abundance of redundant and irrelevant feature. With a fixed number of training samples, the predictive power reduces as the dimensionality increases. Number 3, another advantages. Other things being equal, simpler explanations are generally better than complex ones. It improves the accuracy of a model if the right subset is chosen. Also, it reduces the overfitting, and also it reduces computational or computation time. Another advantage, it helps in data compression and hence reduce storage space. Here we talk about PCA as unsupervised dimensionality reduction and LDA as supervised dimensionality reduction. One PCA is unsupervised dimensionality reduction, LDA as supervised dimensionality reduction. We go to next step to describe what is PCA. Now we are going to discuss about principal component analysis. We call PCA. PCA is a linear dimensionality reduction technique that can be utilized for extracting information from a high dimensional space by projecting it into a lower dimension subspace. PCA tries to preserve the essential parts that have more variation of the data and remove the non essential parts with fewer variations. One important thing to note about PCA is that it is an unsupervised dimensionality reduction technique. You can cluster the similar data points based on the feature correlation between them without any supervision or label. PCA is one of the most popular linear dimension reduction algorithm. It is a projection-based method that perform or transform the data by projecting it onto a set of orthogonal axes. Here we have one example. Suppose we have to transform a two-dimensional representation of data points. Here is X and Y to a one-dimensional representation. So we will try to find a straight line and project data points on them. A straight line is one-dimensional. Here you look at the line. There are many possibilities to select a straight lines. If we see the red lines here, look at the red lines, connecting the projection of blue points on a magenta lines. For example, the perpendicular distance of each data point from the straight line is the projection error. The sum of the error of all data points will be the total projection error. Our new data points will be the projection red points of those original blue data points. As we can see, we have transformed two-dimensional data points to one-dimensional data points by projection them on one-dimensional space. For example, a straight line. That magenta straight line is called the principal axis. Since we are projecting to a single dimension, we have only one principal axis. We apply the same procedure to find the next principal axis from the residual variance. Let's have a look how does PCA works. The first step is to standardize the data, means that normalize the data. Standardization the data before performing PCA. This will ensure that each feature has a mean equal to 0 and variance equal to 1. Z is the formula for this one. The next step, use the standardized data to generate a covariance matrix or perform singular vector decomposition. Build a covariance matrix like this after normalization. Step 3. Obtain eigenvector or principal component and eigenvalue from the covariance matrix. Each eigenvector will have a corresponding eigenvalue. The eigenvectors and eigenvalue of a covariance or correlation matrix represent the core of a PCA. The eigenvectors determine the direction of the new feature space, and the eigenvalue determine their magnitude. In other words, the eigenvalue explain the variance of data along the new feature axis. Step 4. Sort the eigenvalues in descending order. For example, select the k eigenvector with the largest eigenvalue, where k is the number of dimensions used in the new feature space, k less or equal than d. Then construct a new matrix with the selected k eigenvector. The goal of PCA is to reduce the dimensionality of original feature space by projecting it onto a smaller subspace where the eigenvectors will form the axis. However, the eigenvectors only define the directions of a new axis. Since they all have the same unit length 1. In order to decide which eigenvectors can be dropped without losing too much information, we need to inspect the corresponding eigenvalues. The eigenvector with the lowest eigenvalue bears the least information about the distribution of the data. Those are the ones can be dropped. Now it's time to discuss about linear discriminant analysis or LDA. LDA is a supervised technique for dimensionality reduction. The goal is to project a data set onto a lower dimensional space with good class separately. If you look at this picture, the left side we have PCA, which means the component axis that maximize the variance. In the right side we have LDA, maximizing the component axis for class separation. This is, for example, good projection separates class well, bad projection in the y-axis you can see here. So we want to talk how does LDA work. LDA focuses primarily on projecting the feature in high dimensional space to lower dimension. You can achieve this in 3 steps. Step 1. You need to calculate separability between classes, which is the distance between the mean of different classes. This is called between class variance. Secondly, calculate the distance between the mean and sample of each class. It is also called the within class variance. Finally, construct the lower dimensional space which maximizes the between class variance and minimizes the within class variance. P here is considered as the lower dimensional space projection, also called Fisher's criterion. material. Now it's time to implement PCA and LDA in Python. The first step, like the previous one, is to import necessary libraries. Here we import NumPy and Pandas for working data structure and linear algebra. The plot Python library is an interactive open source plotting library that supports over 40 unique chart types covering a wide range of static, financial, geographic, scientists, and three-dimensional use cases. The plot ly. Also, for edit some feature, we import plot ly.tools and plot.graph object. Finally, we import the two-dimensional reduction methods. Let's run this part, and you can see that all we already imported, and the plot, pyplot are also here. The next step is to load the data. So the next step is to load the data. For this lecture, the MNIST we call Mixed National Institute of Standard and Technology Computer Vision Digit Dataset means was chosen partly due to its simplicity and also surprisingly deep and informative research that can be done with the dataset. So let's load the training data and see what we have. This is the dataset that we already collected as a part of training. After you load the data, you can see that you have show train.head 5 head of this data and a lot of data set already available. So you can ask me what is the MNIST data set. This is a set consists of 60,000 rows and 785 columns. There are 28 multiply 28 pixel image of digits contributing to 784 columns, as well as one extra label columns, which is essentially a class label to state whether the row-wise contribution to each digit gives a 1 or a 9. Each row component contains a value between 1 and 0, and this describes the intensity of each pixel. As I mentioned to you, this is the means data set, and when you print the train.shape, it includes 60,000 row and 785 column. So next step, we save the label to a pandas target. This is the label from the training part, and we drop the label feature in order to separate inputs and output. Now it's time to apply PCA. As we said in the step of PCA technique, the first step is to normalize or standardize the data. Then calculating eigenvector and eigenvalue of covariance matrix and sorting the eigenvector pairs from right to left. So here you see we do the standardize the data by using a standard scalar, and after you fit transform, next step is calculating eigenvector and eigenvalue of covariance matrix with the help of this formula. And next step is to create a list tuple. So for eigenvalue and eigenvector, after this I told you to sort the eigenvalue and eigenvector pairs from higher to lower. Next step is to calculate or explain variance from the eigenvalues. Let's run this part. After you run, now it's time to calculate both our individual explained variance and cumulative explained variance value. Let's use the plot visualization package to produce an interactive chart to show this. After this, we want to invoke scikit-learn PCA method. I put the component 30 and I want to run it here. Is using the scikit-learn PCA method. Now it's time to visualize the data. After you visualize the data, you can see how the nice figure came to our result. We will invoke here, we invoke the PCA to only extract the top 30 eigenvalue, top 30. That is why I put here n component is 30 using scikit-learn's dot components call from the digit dataset and visually compare the top 5 eigenvalues to some of the other smaller ones to see if we can clean any insight as follows. The subplot above portray the top 30 optimal direction or principal component access that PCA method has decided to generate for our digit dataset. Of interest is when one compare the first component eigenvalue 1, here is eigenvalue 1, to, for example, eigenvalue 20's component. It is obvious that more complicated direction or components are being generated in the search to maximize variance in the new feature space. It's time to implement PCA through scikit-learn. Now using the scikit-learn tools, we implement the PCA algorithm as follows. We have to visualize first, and also you can delete our earlier created X object by using del X, then taking only the first n rows to speed sync up. By this value, we already take the first n rows. Then here you have to standardize the value. The next step called the PCA method with 5 components. Okay. Now for cluster coloring in our plot section, remember to also restrict the target value. Here is our target value. Now it's time to visualizing. For visualizing, when it comes to this dimensionality reduction method, scatter plots are mostly implemented because they allow for great and convenient visualization of cluster. As observed from the scatter plots here, you can just about make out a few discernible cluster evidence from the collective blotch of colors. This cluster represents the underlying digit that each data point should contribute to, and one may therefore be tempted to think that it was quite a piece of cake in implementing and visualizing PCA in this section. So let's have a look to LDA in Python. It's time to explain how to implement LDA in Python. We use the scikit-learn discriminant analysis module for implementation of LDA. Here, taking in as second argument the target as label. So the syntax for the LEA implementation is very much akin to that PCA, whereby one calls the fit and transform method, which fit the LDA models with the data, and then does a transformation by applying the LDA dimensionality reduction to fit. However, since LDA is a supervised learning algorithm, there is a second argument to the methods that the user must provide, and this would be the class label, which is this case is the target label of the digit. Let's run this part and using the plot library again, and you will see how the LDA first linear discriminant. So visualizing from the scatter plot above, we can see that the data points are more clearly clustered when using LDA in comparison with PCA. See, in PCA, many data points are not clustered and some of them are inside to another cluster, but in LDA, it's more accurate. We compare with the implementation of PCA with class label, LDA make a little bit more clearly. This is an inherent advantage in having class label to supervise the method with. This is the reason that LDA get the better result, because this is supervised. In short, picking the right tools for the right job.